Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Catherine Baird, Director of Science and Policy at River Network. And I am usually in North Carolina. Today I happen to be joining you from our headquarters in Colorado. And so really thanks so much to everyone for joining us and to Stacey for being our presenter today. We're still seeing people come on, but because it is the top of the hour, we're gonna go ahead and get started. So I think many of you were on our first webinar, which was about water infrastructure. We should have that recording up in the next day or so, and we will share that with everyone. But this is the second in our series, and this webinar is Setting Water Rates Basics, How Raising Money for Water Projects Happens at the Local Level. It's the second in our series of 4 webinars, and I'll have the other 2 teed up at the end so you can see what they are and see if you'd like to join us for those webinars. And so I think because most of you were on the first webinar, you know about River Network, but in case there's anyone new, we are a national nonprofit organization, and we really focus on connecting people working on water all around the country in ways to help make their work more effective and connect with others to have greater impact across the country. And you can see we just came back from our National River Rally Conference in Cleveland, where we may have seen some of you there, about 400 to 500 people, and Stacey was with us as well, did a great session on affordability. And so next year we'll be in San Antonio, but we sponsor events like that and training and mentoring across the country. And so thank you to those of you who are our members, and otherwise please feel free to join us. We'd love to have you. And I'm getting some comments that it was hard to hear me. So I would say too that on this GoToWebinar, you can use the chat box and the question box to let us know what's happening. And so I'm going to hand it over in just a sec, but hopefully let me know if you have problems hearing. Okay, and so as background, we came to this topic with Stacey because we have been working on drinking water. It's one of our key issue areas at River Network. And some people ask, well, you're a river organization. Why are you working on drinking water? But it became clear to us over the last, five or so years that drinking water is really a critical issue for so many people across the country. I mean, it's really almost a moral imperative. And if you're talking about water, to be drinking on, to be working on this issue. And so many of you may come from places where drinking water is either contaminated, there are access issues, or affordability issues. And so as we started working on this issue and trying to figure out how we could be helpful in providing resources to the folks in our community and our network, we worked with a number of people across the country to sort of see where the gaps were and what we could do to be helpful and really help everyone work on drinking water in a way that was appropriate to where they lived and what they wanted to work on. So we recently published a drinking water guide. The website is at the bottom of this slide. It's on our website. It's an online form, and it's basically an overview A to Z resource of about drinking water, and the sections you can see there, sections 1 through 6, which start at source water. Where does your drinking water come from? All the way to treatment, the tap, funding, and section 6, which is focused on community action and advocacy. The questions were really informed by everyone we heard from, and we did a survey and a lot of outreach to figure out how to focus this drinking water guide. So if you go and use it and download it, we would love your comments. It's out there. We'll be doing more training on this in the coming year or two, but always trying to think of ways to get it out there, get it in service and in ways that are going to be most useful and really applied in people's communities. But with this webinar series, section 4 is focused on what does drinking water cost and what is my water bill paying for. And over the course of developing this guide, we really recognized and heard from people there's just a lot of energy in this area about what is drinking water, how do we pay for water infrastructure, like why are my rates higher, how do you encourage conservation and efficiency with my water rates, and how are decisions about water rates made. So with that in mind, I turned to Stacey, who's our presenter today. I'm going to tell you about her a little bit in a second, to try to provide these overview webinars to really provide some baseline information so all of us can be more effective in hopefully thinking about advocating for solutions in our communities or at the state or federal level on water infrastructure and sort of trying to better understand that. So I'm really pleased that Stacey's with us here today to provide this overview, and just know that we have time for questions in this webinar. So please feel free to use the chat box or the question anytime. I will be watching it throughout the webinar and can pause and we can have a conversation if you have a question about something that Stacey talks about, or that you just otherwise related that you might have a question about. So I'm going to introduce Stacey and then really just hand it over to her. So Stacey Isaac Berahzer, she is the founder of IB Environmental, which is a consulting firm she started. But before that, she served as a senior project director with the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And her main areas of expertise are pricing and affordability of water services, as well as stormwater management, stormwater and watershed management. She has an MBA from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and she mainly works in Georgia, where she's very involved in leadership issues there in the environmental community, and served on the board of directors for the Institute for Georgia Environmental Leadership. And as you'll hear today, she truly brings a passion, as well as, I have to say, a sense of humor in teaching about environmental protection and throughout, and with her 16 years of experience. And she speaks and works at workshops throughout the country and throughout the year. So Stacey, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm going to go ahead and send the sharing over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Catherine, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Thank you also to the River Network for hosting this webinar series. I am going to switch over to my screen. And give me 1 sec while I get things going here. I'll just wait for someone to interject if you're not seeing my screen, but I will assume that you are.
I can.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Oops. Catherine set the bar really high. It's easier to be humorous when I'm in front of an audience. It's a little bit harder on a webinar. So I'll try to make this a little entertaining, but humorous might be a little bit hard to achieve. Anyway, thanks for joining again. Like Catherine said, we want you guys to get what you need out of this this time. So do enter questions and we'll try to address those either at the end or as we go through, depending on what seems more appropriate. So in terms of an outline, this is what we hope to cover today. We want to give you some background on rate setting in general. We want to look at objectives when a group or an entity is doing rate setting. We'll talk about what we call the elements of rate design, so the different components that come together to create a rate structure for water. We'll also talk about the different types of rate structures and the pros and cons, or sort of the goals of each type. We'll look very quickly at full cost accounting, benchmarks, and asset management, mainly just so that you're familiar with those terms. The goal here is that we expect folks on this webinar are wanting to engage with their local water utility or some water utility that they're trying to work with. And we want to make sure that you have the lingo that the water utilities are using, and that you sort of understand how to communicate with the utility staff and the decision makers. So that's the goal here. So those last 3 topics we'll just hit really quickly because they do relate to rate setting, but we won't spend a whole lot of time on those. So just managing expectations here. All right, so let's dive into the background a little. This is a throwback to webinar 1 in the series that Catherine referred to. Basically, we discussed in webinar 1 that the money for water infrastructure is probably not coming from the federal government. So these are the trends, if you will, in where financing for water infrastructure has come from over the last few decades. And as you can see, that red line is not showing signs of going up anytime soon. And so the water utilities, and this applies to wastewater utilities as well as stormwater utilities. Really, in general, money for all those different sort of aspects of water needs to be generated at the local level. And so this webinar is picking up on how you generate that money, which is really centered around rate setting. So that's where we are, just to kind of relate the two in the series, the 2 different webinars. Again, we are picturing you guys as wanting to interact and engage with the rate setting process. And so we're trying to give you tools to do that. So I first want to mention that many, I'll say governing boards, sometimes it's called city council, it might be the public utilities board. These decision-making entities, unfortunately, there's no one formula. You have to kind of go to the website for the utility or the community that you're interested in and poke around a little bit. I did this for South Bend just because I'd been doing some work in South Bend recently. And in their case, you go around the website and you click around looking for the schedule of meetings when the board actually gets together in person. And I found that, the Board of Public Works has this meeting schedule. It's published online. So I just gave you an image there as an example. Like I said, it depends on the community. There's no one magic formula that will get you to the web page that gives you the meeting schedule. But the point is, you want to find out when this group meets, whether it's called the city council or the utility board, and you want to go to those meetings. They are supposed to be open to the public, and maybe first you just kind of listen and pay attention, try to get the feel of things, but at some point you want to show up and ask questions, or you want to prepare yourself somehow for these meetings. And so that's sort of one of the goals of this webinar today. Okay, as an overview, what should go into reviewing rates for the next year? So ideally, a water utility should look at its rates, at least review the rates every year, and then decide if the rates need to get increased. Usually the rates do not decrease. That's pretty rare, although it does happen once in a while. What should the utility consider, and what should you be helping them consider? We want to decide if the rates that we're looking at, the rate structure that we're considering, will it provide sufficient cost recovery? So that's really a primary goal of the rate setting process. We also want to make sure that we all know exactly what provide sufficient cost recovery means, and that it means the same thing to everyone on the decision-making around the decision-making table. Are we following state law? So this is a whole other topic, but there are a lot of resources out there on how different states sort of govern rate setting at the local level. So we want to make sure that the rate structure that we're looking at or considering does follow the laws of the specific state, and I can provide some resources for that as well. Are we allocating the cost to the right customers? So in rate setting, any type of pricing, it's ideal when there could be sort of this close cost-benefit relationship, or the rates should be equitable where possible. And so different groups of customers should be paying their cost for the service. Will our customers understand these rates? So we want the rates to achieve a lot of things and do a lot of things, but at the same time, we don't want them to be too complicated, because ideally the customers should be able to understand the rates. Beyond just understanding the rates, will our customers be able to pay these rates? So how do the rates and the bills that would come out of these rates relate to the ability to pay or the income of the particular community that's being served? Also, do these rates send the right signals to our customers based on our objectives? And those terms, objectives and signals, are going to mean a little bit more to you as we go through the webinar. Okay, another way of looking at this too is what I would consider to be the ideal process of rate setting. So you'll see this slide as well as the previous one. They come from the Environmental Finance Center that Catherine also mentioned. They are really a national resource when it comes to water, wastewater, and stormwater rate setting. Even though they're based in North Carolina, they do work nationally. And so a lot of these slides you'll see kind of refer to their resources and stuff that they put together. So I did kind of stick the word ideal in there, right? So we want to look at the characteristics of our community. So we want to have background on rates, and we want to look at our unique characteristics in the community that we're dealing with. And then we want to come up with a rate structure that seems most appropriate. We'll calculate the rates, we'll do projections to make sure that the rates are giving us the revenue that we need going forward, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years. But it is very unlikely that a utility will hit the mark perfectly. So this is an iterative process where they must reevaluate the rates that they set for last year and feed that new information and the findings that they have into the next round of rate setting. And so it kind of is a loop, if you like. So this slide here has a lot of words, but these words come directly in general out of this manual. The image on the lower right of the screen is what's called the M1 manual. It's called that fondly, but it's a manual on the principles of water rates, fees, and charges that's put out by the American Water Works Association. So it's probably their #1 bestseller for this national or even binational. It's Canadian and American and US. And I think this is usually their bestseller in terms of the different manuals of practice that the organization puts out. So it's sometimes referred to as the Bible of water rate setting. So I wanted to pull out some of the objectives that they state directly. That's why there are so many words on the slide. But full cost recovery is very important, right? You want to set rates that cover the cost of providing the service. And we'll get back to the full cost recovery concept later in the webinar. You want ideally rates that are producing revenue stability and predictability. It's easier to manage a utility when there's a certain level of revenue stability. You also, I highlighted two here, well, I put them in bold. I thought that this group may be most interested in these particular concepts of equity, and I did shorten that one. I think the exact language in the M1 manual is fairness and the apportionment of total cost of service among the different ratepayers. You want to avoid discrimination. Now that can be a double-edged sword because we've seen some of the programs that try to address affordability for low-income customers be sort of hindered by this concept of, well, we can't provide a subsidy within the rates because it's helping one class of customers, and that sort of violates this particular bullet. So there are lots of goals or objectives here. That the rates are simple and easy to understand. Think about those bubbles that we saw a couple slides ago. We want the rates to be simple to administer, definitely legal and defensible. A utility is trying to meet, ideally, all of these objectives when it sets its rate structure. So it is a very ambitious list, and so it's sometimes a balancing act as well to be able to, for example, have rates that are easy to understand, but actually achieve some of these other objectives. In terms of some more background here, another concept that I wanted to introduce is this one of price elasticity. So there are almost two schools of thought represented on this slide. Let's start with the first couple bullets. The idea of elasticity is, it refers to the fact that when a product, in quotation marks, gets more expensive, people usually reduce their use of that product. So we say, in Economics 101, if you took that in college, that demand drops for that product because the price increased. So a very elastic product has substitutes that people can switch to. So maybe if orange juice became very expensive, people would drink more tea or more apple juice. But water does not really have very good substitutes in general. No one wants to brush their teeth with orange juice or tea. So we say that it's not the most elastic product around. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. But there is some sort of elasticity involved as well. So when it comes to people simply using less of the product, in this case, maybe outdoor watering will be reduced if the price of water gets to a certain level, in terms of increasing to a certain level. So on the one hand, the first couple bullets say that raising rates does lower water use. Therefore, you'll sell less of the product, and utilities need to consider that when they are doing their revenue projections. And a suggested rule of thumb here, if the utility doesn't have more specific local data, they can start with this one, somewhere between 2 and 6%. As we assume that water use will decline, maybe around 3%, as rates increase for every 10% that rates increase. So if you don't have anything else to go on at the local level, you can probably use that general rule of thumb. But then sort of on the other hand, AWWA in the same M1 manual that I mentioned before is saying that most water is considered to be relatively, inelastic. But they do point, like we did earlier, to things like outdoor watering, sort of outside uses and maybe in the industrial setting that would be more sensitive to the price of water. So a couple of things to consider there.
Good. Hey, Stacey, I've got a question for you, and so you might be addressing this, so stop me. But the question has to do like, how does consideration of risk come into water rates? So, for example, if water quantity is at risk, like you'll have to find a new source, or if water quality is degraded to the point that treatment is needed, is that reflected, or how is that taken into consideration, if at all, on the rates?
Well, it should be, and we'll touch on that a little bit. There's something that I'll refer to later on that's called sort of the hierarchy of full cost pricing. So we'll touch on that, Catherine, when we talk about full cost pricing. But basically, the operation and maintenance, the oil or the valves or whatever that you need to replace today is like your highest priority in terms of the hierarchy. But then we do aspire towards things like non-mandated watershed protection, for instance, because of some of what you're saying. So yeah, I'll try to come back to that later on in the slide.
Okay, great.
It's a good question. And if I don't get a whole lot of time to talk about that, risk should be considered. Each locality has different risk levels for flooding or drought or hurricanes, and that should be folded in to the rate structure. And there are a couple of Excel tools that actually help you do that. Good. Well, thanks for bringing that up, Catherine. So going back here to the sort of the background information continued and how rates and usage interact, this is an interesting slide that comes from two examples in North Carolina. So Fayetteville is a city in North Carolina, and a long time ago now, 2004, there was this cartoon in the newspaper that I think reflects public perception of water utilities, unfortunately. So you have this guy who's just seemed wealthy and has his pockets lined with money, and he's telling this poor little guy, this is the consumer, that when you consume water, we have a deficit, so I have to raise your rates. And he's just shaking all the money he can out of him, right? So that's kind of public perception. And unfortunately, the current predominant model in the water sector is that the more conservation that users achieve, like this little guy here, it often prompts or even the conservation is actually often prompted or even demanded by the utility because of a drought, for instance. But the more conservation that the users achieve, the higher the likelihood of a rate increase in the near future for these same consumers. So customers do feel like they're being punished for their good conservation behavior. And it's sort of inherent in the traditional current model of setting water and sewer rates, unfortunately. There are ways to mitigate this, and some utilities like the Charlotte-Mecklenburg utility, also in North Carolina, have been working on that. Another North Carolina utility, though, is highlighted here in that colorful bar chart. And here you see what happened after a drought. So the black line is sort of revenue projections. And once the drought was finished and the utility said, hey, the Orange Water and Sewer Authority said, you can kind of go back to, you don't have to, we don't have those drought restrictions anymore. You can kind of go back to your normal watering schedule. People didn't. So maybe it's the university community, that's why. It says University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So they learned really well, and they realized that, if they watered their grass just 2 days instead of 5 days a week, it didn't die. And so the point is, those red bars show that the revenues never got back to what the utility predicted. And so that's a planning challenge. So this will hopefully make more sense too when we go through the section on types of rate structures. I was talking about Charlotte-Mecklenburg and how they sort of address this. But why does this happen? Why are these red bars here? And why do the revenues often not go back to the pre-drought conditions, for instance? And this is an example from Charlotte-Mecklenburg. Again, it was from several years ago. And this utility has adjusted. So that's the good news. But we will talk about base charges or fixed charges this later on. But this chart is showing revenues on this side. I think you guys can see my mouse. These are the revenues that the utility is bringing in, and then these are the expenses, so the money that's going out. The blue areas represent what is variable, what money or amounts change based on how much water is sold. So in this case, revenues were greatly affected by the amount of water that was sold. But on the expenses side, the only thing that changes if people use less or more water is really power and chemicals. All of the other costs that the utility have kind of stay constant from month to month, despite selling maybe just a small amount of water. So that's kind of the inherent challenge. And so this utility, this is a story for another day, but they were able to increase their base charge to kind of make this a little bit more even. And we'll talk about base charges a little bit later on too, and hopefully that would make more sense. So it's not as one-sided anymore for Charlotte-Mecklenburg as these charts highlight. But for a lot of utilities, this is where they're coming from. And so it's a lot of vulnerability when the level of water use changes. So we want to try to get away from that to an extent and mitigate that. And so there's a whole movement in the industry to kind of go away from selling gallons of water and kind of charge more as, you know, we're providing a service. So, okay, that's some background, some concepts to kind of keep in mind. Let's talk now about specific rate setting objectives. And I would say here that the objectives of each utility should be ranked. Pretty big components of that after having gone through ranking exercises with a lot of utilities or groups that were pretending to be utilities in different workshops. We are not usually on the same page, or in many cases, we cannot predict what a utility, how they would rank the objectives, okay? So when you think about your objectives, you want to look at what makes up the particular community that's being served. So in order to set objectives and prioritize them, we need to first understand the community that's being served. So are there a lot of large families? Is there seasonal demand? So for example, do a lot more people come to this community in the winter because it's a ski community? Do a lot more people come in the summer because it's a beach community? You have to understand all of those things about the given community when you're looking at setting objectives. If the utility has big capital expenses, so they need to add big pieces of equipment or new plants, for instance, in the next few years, that's something to consider. Are there loans that need to be repaid? We have to consider those debt service requirements as well in the rate setting process. Right now, to Catherine's question too, if we don't have enough water, so we don't expect to be able to meet demand comfortably, for example, if there's a drought or if somehow our water source has been contaminated, how are we going to address that? And that should result in increased rates in most cases, right? And again, to reiterate, there should actually be an exercise where the utilities decision makers rank these different priorities or objectives. So again, this is a tool that I used a lot that was developed by the Environmental Finance Center. And so project prioritization is embedded here. There are only 4 objectives on this particular slide, but the given utility can come up with other objectives and rank them. So the point here is to refer to this list of ranked priorities or ranked objectives and focus on the highest ranked objectives when following the guidelines for setting or selecting the appropriate rate structure design. If the utility, for example, identifies conservation as a high priority, then maybe all you need to do is remind them of that from time to time as they make decisions. If they have a different set of priorities and conservation is not high up there, then your job is a little bit bigger probably to sort of try to convince them of the importance of water conservation. But to make sure everyone is still engaged, we're going to do a quick poll now, and Catherine's going to help us with that.
Okay, hold on, everyone. Link this poll up. Just a sec. It's fine.
Okay, sure. I'll just go ahead and read the poll question in the meantime. So if you had to guess, either for your local water utility or one that you're trying to engage with more right now, which of the following do you guess is the highest priority for that water utility?
Okay, poll is open. So feel free to select one of the answers. All right, we got some answers come in. Let's see what people think. Okay, so Stacey, I'll let you know. All right, we got a few more people who are voting. Anyone else voting? What do you think the highest priority for your local water utility? What would you guess? Okay, so Stacey, so far it looks like the results are that 92% voted for full cost recovery revenue stability and 8% fostering business friendly practices. So
Okay, no, I did say before, sometimes it's hard to guess. But yeah, I certainly have seen those kind of rise to the top. And again, when you have to rank it, so maybe most of the utilities you work with say, yeah, we do care about conservation. But let's be real, when conservation is stacked against some of these other things like full cost recovery, then sometimes it falls to lower in the list. Catherine, are we, I got a note here that we're having some technical difficulties.
Okay, hold on just a sec. Let's see. Okay, so can you guys see Stacey's screen?
It says on my end that screen sharing is now paused, so I may have to start sharing again.
Okay, hold on. Yeah, go ahead and start. You should be able to now.
Okay. All right, so you should be seeing sort of a slide with the poll question. And then the next slide that I just moved to says elements of rate design. If we go back to the poll question just for a minute, I was saying that it is a good exercise to go through. Sometimes there is some concern for conservation, but when it's stacked against things like revenue stability or full cost recovery, it's important to kind of go through that exercise and see where our priorities are. And I also mentioned that it doesn't mean that all the objectives or priorities were on this list, right? The utility can brainstorm what their priorities are. Okay, so this is, again, an exercise that I recommend. If you can actually get this sort of worksheet off of the website, or you can contact me and I can send it to you. But it's really it's a tough exercise to go through, but it really is important. So, all right, I'll move on from that. We'll talk about the different elements of rate design now. So when putting together a rate structure, these are the elements that one should consider. We'll look at them in turn in a minute, but here's how they may play out in a specific community. So I will kind of move to the next slide to show you how these work. So customer classes, usually it's recommended that you just don't charge all of your customers the same rate structure. Usually there's at least a residential class and an industrial or commercial class. Even for the smallest utilities, that's a recommendation. Now for larger, more sophisticated utilities, you may have like a multi-family rate structure that relates to like apartment buildings and different types of residential classes, etc. But it's a good practice to have at least two different customer classes because your commercial and industrial customers do not use water like your residential, and so the sort of the burden that they place on the utility is different, and so that should be reflected in your rate structure. Billing period, we've seen usually it's monthly or bi-monthly. Quarterly is also sort of common. I would say ideally utilities should move towards a monthly billing period. So that's how often they send their bills out. And some of them will say that their billing software won't allow that. And what you need to do is keep up with when they upgrade their billing software, even if it's after 20 years, and try to advocate for getting that option of a monthly bill in there. Base charges, we'll talk about exactly what base charges are if it's not apparent already from the name. But if the majority of customers, so we're pretending here this is a rural water utility that has high costs and extra capacity, and it's concerned about affordability, right? The base charge, there are a couple different options there. Consumption allowance will also make more sense as we get into this a little bit more, but maybe including some what we call a lifeline amount of about 2,000 gallons per month might be a good idea. In terms of volumetric rate structure, again, if you don't know what a uniform rate structure is, we'll talk about it in a minute, but that's what might be recommended for a small rural utility. And then you have a couple other options there. But number 8, look at bullet or point 8, the frequency of rate changes probably should be annual. At least each utility should be looking or reviewing their rate structure, looking at or reviewing their rate structure on an annual basis. What we want to avoid is long periods of no rate adjustments and then huge double-digit rate increases. If you want to talk utility lingo to the staff of the utility, use the term double-digit rate increases. That is a no-no. If we can avoid it, we try to at all costs. So types of rate structure, like I said, will start to become more apparent here. So the consumption allowance that I mentioned before, each rate structure has what's usually a fixed or base charge, and that's the portion of the cost that does not differ from month to month. It's not affected by the amount of water a customer uses, it's fixed. And then on top of that base charge, we have a volumetric charge, which is related to the amount of water used. So we'll look at different types of volumetric rate charges going forward, but an important consideration in setting rates, especially where affordability and conservation are concerned, is do we include any water, quote unquote, for free with the base charge? A lot of different parts of the country, it's really common to include 0 gallons of water. In the Southeast, it's a little bit more common to include 1,000 or 2,000 gallons per month, for example, with that base charge. Including a high amount with the base charge starts to erode your water conservation price signals. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, so we're going to get into what some of these actual rate structures look like. So the first one is supposed to be considered fair and simple. It's called a uniform rate. I really don't like the term flat rate, but some folks do say, you know, it's a flat rate, but really a flat bill is very uncommon in the US now. It's used when there are no water meters. So that's what a flat bill would be. It'd be, according to one of my colleagues in Georgia, it's $20 a month to waste all the water that you can. It's the way it considers flat fees. But in some cases, folks do call the uniform rate structure flat, but we prefer the term uniform. So this is how it works. You should see some animation on your side. So the price, the first chart on all of the next few slides you'll look at, looks at the price per 1,000 gallons of water, so price per unit. And then the bottom or lower chart shows what a customer's bill is going to look like. So with uniform, every 1,000 gallons costs the same, the first and the last. And this is what a bill looks like. So the more water you use, your bill goes up by a steady rate. With a seasonal uniform rate, so let's say you are in a beach community and you want to charge a higher rate, say in the summer than the winter. This is what your winter price will look like and the bill to match that. In the summer, the rates are higher and you'll see that the bill increases a little bit more steeply because of that higher per unit price. For an increasing block rate, these are supposed to be conservation oriented in terms of why we put these blocks in. And one of the considerations or cautions here that I like to mention is with increasing block rates, we want to consider large families, because a large family may not be using a lot of extra water or sort of unnecessary water, but they will end up in these sort of higher blocks. Okay, I feel like we went back here. All right, so this is what an increasing block rate looks like. For the first block, in this case, going to about 4,000 gallons, it's one price. And this is what the bill looks like to correspond to that lower price. But then when you get to like 4,000 gallons, the price increases a little bit more steeply. A decreasing block rate is not very common anymore. These were mainly used for industrial customers, and we can take questions on that if we have those later on. But this is what these look like. So it's the opposite of an increasing block rate, where as you use more water, your bill goes up less steeply. And the recommendation there is not to use that for residential customers. It's sort of an incentive to waste water, if you will. So hopefully those sort of animations help to give you a visual of how these rate structures affect bills for customers. Block designs is a very important thing to consider. So we talked about increasing and decreasing block rates, but you want to look at where the block starts and ends. You don't want to have too many blocks. So we've seen examples of like 15 blocks. That is way too complicated, and it was actually not a very large utility that had that. And then when a customer goes from one block to the next, you want that rate differential to be significant enough that it does encourage water conservation. In order for block rates or effective, you want to keep in mind the sort of that relationship or the ratio between the base charge and consumption allowance and the rest of your bill. When you institute increasing block rates, especially, then customers start insisting on the meter reading being punctual. They want the meters to be accurate. If you do a 30-day reading and then you do the next cycle, you don't get around to reading the meters for 36 days, you can see how that may put the user or the customer into a higher block and have a more significant impact on their bill. And again, we give a caution here to think about large families, especially with increasing block rates. Something to consider depending on what part of the country or the conditions, weather and climate conditions of the local utility is a drought rate. And the important thing about drought rates is that they have to be decided on in advance. And it gives the utility the ability to just temporarily, under drought conditions, to raise the rates to help the utility sort of overcome the revenue gap that would ensue from customers using less water. But you cannot put in a drought rate like while the drought is happening. Then it's too late. You have to kind of get the ordinance and everything accepted beforehand. All right, we're going to have another poll here. Which type of rate structure is best for promoting water efficiency and conservation? So we had a quick overview of rate structures, which is best for promoting water efficiency and conservation.
Okay, that poll should be open, everyone. Hopefully you see it on your computer. So select one. What type of rate structure is best for promoting water efficiency and conservation? All right, so distributing the poll. Okay, we're collecting responses so far. It looks like people are voting, Stacey, for increasing block rate. We saw some more coming in, but that seems to be where people are landing. So I think, yeah, increasing block rates seems to be the consensus today.
Okay, I think that is a good choice of answer. I will say, though, that it wasn't really a trick question, but if you have a really high-priced uniform rate, it would probably send a more significant price signal to your customers than, say, an increasing block rate. So let's just use numbers. If the cost for each 1,000 gallons was $5 in a uniform rate versus an increasing block rate where the cost for 1,000 gallons was $1.50, we can see how the uniform rate can actually compete, right? If we're assuming that people are looking at their bills and thinking, oh no, I need to save water because I'm paying too much. So I'm just making a pitch for a really well-designed, adequately priced uniform rate. But yeah, you guys got the concept there. Increasing block rates are, one of the goals is to encourage water conservation and efficiency. All right, a couple of resources here on pricing out the rate structure. So we've designed a rate structure and we need to figure out how it's actually going to work based on the number of customers we have now, how many customers we plan to add because our area is growing or lose because our population is decreasing, etc. There are some resources on this slide here to kind of what I call price out the rate structure. It's just some select references. I'm not saying that this is an exhaustive list, but something to come back to later on when the webinar, the slides are posted online. Okay, so this is the section where I said we're just going to give you quick highlights on some concepts that tie into rate setting, and you need to at least be able to use these terms when you talk with utility folks. So full cost accounting. If we go back to this slide that we looked at before from the M1 manual, the main objective, or the first one, is full cost recovery, and so that's what full cost accounting is trying to get to. We use full cost accounting for different things. It has different applications. Certainly one of the most important applications is rate setting, or how user fees are developed. Okay, we are trying to grab and capture all the different costs that go into providing this water, stormwater, or wastewater service. And we want to be as comprehensive as possible and then we design our fees or rate structure based on the revenue needs that our full cost accounting is telling us we need to generate. This kind of relates to the question that came up before about risk. So when you think about what you're trying to cover with full cost, there's a hierarchy, like I mentioned. The basic need is to cover your day-to-day operating and maintenance expenditures. Maybe after that on the spectrum would be reactive maintenance. If something broken, we have to fix it. And then we kind of proceed all the way along a spectrum. To the other end of the spectrum is non-mandated watershed protection. So in the example from the question, maybe it was necessary because the drinking water source is contaminated or a similar situation. But we're looking to actually think about watershed protection. And a term in the drinking water world that I probably should have put on the slide, but you can scribble down, is source water protection. So that's the term like the EPA would use, etc. And some of the loans and grant funds that are available can be used for watershed protection, or in other words, source water protection. And this would be probably a more typical hierarchy, but if your source water is contaminated or at risk because of drought, you just don't have enough supply, then I can see how that comes higher up on this hierarchy. So again, this might be typical, but it does depend. The order in this hierarchy does depend on the particular utility and the conditions locally. Wanted to touch a little bit about benchmarking here too. So it's basically comparing the utility to itself over time. So last year, your operating ratio was X, and this year it's improved. We've measured it again, and it's improving. So we're seeing good trends, or you sometimes can compare with benchmarks one utility to other similar utilities. And we aim here to compare apples to apples instead of apples to oranges. But low-hanging fruit, where to find benchmarks. We covered benchmarks a little bit in webinar one. We gave a couple examples there. But some low-hanging fruit are these state dashboards that are produced by the Environmental Finance Center at UNC. So this happens to be Georgia, and it's an older dashboard. I know that they have a 2018, probably even a 2019 version of this up by now. But it gives you these different dials here of benchmarks. It tells you the cost of water at 5,000 gallons. You can slide these things around. There's an affordability benchmark here. And then some of the dashboards actually have additional tabs here that are focused on benchmarks specifically. So if you don't want to go and create or calculate your own benchmarks, this is what I call low-hanging fruit. Now, if you're not in Georgia, there's good news. There are at least a dozen other states that have dashboards similar to this. So you can go to the website and see if your state where your utility is one of them. So a quick, easy way to get some benchmarks to kind of see how your utility is doing over time or compared to others, at least in the state. This is one example. Another accessible resource on how to measure intelligently and intelligently compare utility metrics and performance is this short video that was funded by the Water Research Foundation. And so that link will take you to it. And I like to say a lot of the Water Research Foundation resources are actually behind a paywall where you have to be a paying subscriber to access it. But in this particular case, I believe this was funded partly by EPA, so it's publicly accessible. So take advantage of that. And this gives you, just like in our personal finances, we have credit scores, and that helps us to borrow more cheaply if we have a high or good credit score, and it's a little bit more costly to borrow if we have a low or poor credit score. Utilities also have sort of credit rating agencies. In this case, this particular quote is from Moody's. They put together a document on water and sewer rating, their rating methodology, and they say, some of these things that we're looking at, some of these best practices do play into the utility credit rating. And so it kind of gives you tips on how, as a utility, you can improve your credit rating and therefore have better or easier access to the debt market and not pay as much in interest, basically. So this is something that if the utility that you're working with or engaging with is not aware of how these different credit rating agencies are seeing some of these best practices, you might want to draw that to their attention. After the economic sort of crash around 2008, they've paid a lot more attention, and they've sort of redesigned how they rate water and sewer and stormwater systems, or local government utilities in general. This slide is also from Moody's, and it's talking about Cobb County, Georgia, which just happens to be where I live, and they have a lot of good things to say about this utility. You know, it's strong management, etc. And the point of this slide, though, is to show that one utility can do both good financial management and good practices, and be a good manager of the resource. So in addition to having this AAA rating, as we call it, which is the highest rating that a local government can have, Cobb County was also the WaterSense Promotional Partner of 2011. And so that's a water conservation and water efficiency program that EPA runs. So, you know, is it possible to be both a good financial steward and a good steward of the natural resource? This is an example of, you know, that it's possible. And so sharing this with your utility, for instance, can probably give you some credibility and hopefully make them sit up and pay more attention to what you're trying to advocate for. Another quick concept here that can help our case is asset management. In a nutshell, asset management is working smarter, not harder. It's a common sense approach to management. We all practice it, hopefully, in our even personal lives, but there's ever so often there seems to be a new term for it. There used to be effective utility management was the buzz term at one point. Asset management is sort of where we are right now, but it's good, sensible, common sense, I guess, management. So it helps the utility to make the most of its resources. So utilities, like all the rest of us, we don't have unlimited time, we don't have unlimited resources, and we certainly don't have unlimited dollars. So how do we take these limited dollars and find the best possible way to use them? So that also has a lot to do with prioritization. So this is just one example, and I wanted to include for you the source for this. And so there's an environmental finance center that's based in the Southwest, in New Mexico, and they have developed this framework that I think is pretty sensible in terms of addressing asset management. So it looks at the current state of the assets, it looks at the level of service that the utility is trying to provide to its customers, which is a good point to, you know, engage the customers on as well. Like, what level of service are you expecting from us? So how fast do you think we need to fix a leak when it happens? And it's a good opportunity to engage your customer base as well. Criticality is the concept of, we might have two widgets in the water system, and if one of them breaks, it's going to be a catastrophe, like a whole area is going to get flooded, for instance. And then the other widget, if it breaks, it's not a good thing, but we have a couple weeks to fix it, and it's not going to flood a neighborhood. You know, the criticality there is looking at how extensive would be the effects of a particular piece of equipment or widget, in this case, failing. Life cycle costing is another part of asset management, but again, this is a great framework, I think, for starting off in asset management and sort of building up the system at the utility level. If the utility has not been doing asset management, I think the main thing is for them to just get started, and something simple like this table is where they can start. So an inventory of what do we have? What should we be keeping track of over time? And it's okay if a lot of these rows and columns, well, especially some of them, we don't have the information. It's okay for them to be blank at first, but it's good to have this framework set up at some point and then try to fill in as much of this information going forward as possible. So maybe, well, number one, we don't know what its expected useful life is because we didn't keep track of when we put it in. That would be terrible. But when we put a new well in, we have these columns, and we're trying to keep up with how to manage the asset. So it's a little intimidating when you don't have all of the data to fill in here, but the key is to start, and then with time, you'll get there.
And Stacey, this isn't required, right? Is that just something that you sort of well-managed utilities will do?
That's a good question, Catherine. So with the, let's see, changes to the Clean Water State Revolving Fund program, which is an important loan program for water infrastructure across the country. So it doesn't cover drinking water, it more relates to wastewater and stormwater. In some changes that happened at the federal level a few years ago, they do have a term fiscal sustainability plan saying that any utility at any state that's borrowing from the Clean Water State Revolving Fund needs to have a fiscal sustainability plan. And remember I told you guys there are just a lot of different terms for good common sense management. A fiscal sustainability plan is really an asset management plan from what I can tell. And so technically in all states, if you want to borrow from the Clean Water SRF, you need to have an asset management plan. So that's one way that the federal government has sort of pushed this, but it's not required on the drinking water side in a lot of states, in all states I should say. But it's a good practice. And if your utility that you're working with is not doing it right now, they will at some point regret not doing it because they'll apply for a loan program and not get as many points, not score as well as some of the utilities that are doing asset management. So there are different ways that it's being promoted, but not mandatory in all cases. It's a great question. So I wanted to point out some tools as well. These, if we post, I think we're going to post the slides as a PDF. So these should be able to just, there'll be hyperlinks and you can click on them. It will take you to some tools that relate to rate setting. For example, the dashboards that I mentioned would be here, and a couple of related tools. This is probably the key one, water and sewer rate analysis model in terms of rate setting, but the others like capital improvement are relevant as well. And then we had another poll. Which of the following is an advantage of monthly billing? I'll let Catherine pull that up.
All right, working on it. Here we go. Last poll. Okay, poll's out there. Here we go. Which is the following? Answers coming in. Wait for a few more. Okay, so far, Stacey, folks, we got more votes coming in, but right now, it looks like people are liking the last answer of all of the above, which is always one of my favorite answers too. Oh no, and one person, or not one person, but 8% of respondents also voting for customers are better able to pay their monthly bills. So those are the two answers we're seeing right now. I'm going to go ahead and close this out, turn it back to you. Thanks everyone for responding.
Great. Well, yeah, I think the best answer is all of the above. So I really just use this poll question to reiterate why monthly billing was so good. But bear in mind, be patient with your utility. If it says, oh, billing software, I tell people I'm going to come back in my next life as a billing software like expert, or it's amazing how the billing software can hamstring different initiatives that a utility tries to do. So ever so often, like I imagine that they have this wish list of items that their new billing software, whether it's 5 years or 10 years down the line, will have, and you need to tell them to put monthly billing capabilities in there. So yeah, it's all of these. So it's better for the water system. Their revenue stream is a little bit more steady. And then the customer as well can sort of budget better because they're not paying a bill every 2 months or every 3 months, which sometimes we're not all equally disciplined to put aside the money on a, from paycheck to paycheck. So it helps the customers a little bit because the bills come more frequently. And yes, leaks tend to be found faster because we see the bill and we say, oh my goodness, why is my bill 3 times what it was last month? And so it's from a conservation resource or resource conservation, point of view, it's also better. Now there's an additional cost. If you're billing every 2 months, it's costing you less in stamps and envelopes to print and mail those bills. But generally, monthly billing, sort of the advantages outweigh things like the additional costs of more frequent billing if you're going from bi-monthly to quarterly. All right, so we'll quickly just revisit the outline, right? We had some background, then we talked about the objectives of rate setting, we talked about different elements of rate design, and then we folded that into what types of rate structures kind of come out of those elements. And we quickly looked at full cost accounting, the benchmarks, and asset management as sort of good practices that we should fold into the rate setting process, or help the utilities that we're working with to consider when they do set their rates. So with that, I'm going to see if Catherine has any more questions, but in the meantime, this is my contact information if you want to get in touch with us after the webinar. But Catherine, what questions might you have that you want to raise at this point from the audience?
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Stacey. And so people, please, you know, type your questions into the question box. A couple laws I've got so far is one question in one of the early slides, you talked about what affects rates, and you talked about, you know, what are the state laws? What types of state laws typically affect rates, and what, you know, what would they be addressing?
Okay, so where I've spent most of my time and energy on that is kind of going to state statutes and looking to see where they mention water or utility rate setting. And I was looking specifically for, can the rates be used to fund a customer assistance program? So let's assume that you have affordability concerns in a certain utility. Does the state prevent or encourage, or is it neutral on, can the utility raise its rates to a level where it generates the revenue needed to fund a customer assistance program? But it was not, I mean, there was not a whole lot of language to look at in each state, right? So the states usually have statutes that say that rates should be reasonable, water and sewer rates should be just, or you know, so there's a lot of room for interpretation, for better or for worse. There were very few that said, you know, rates have to be totally equitable, and you can't use rates from one group of customers who may be higher income to subsidize another group. That was very rare. And then there were a couple of states that said you totally should set rates with low-income customer assistance programs in mind. And so that's what I looked at. Beyond the state statutes, then we tried to find case law that looked specifically at this question of affordability, and we didn't find any case law on that. But there is more case law coming out now, a little bit more on lead service lines, for instance, and how utilities address those at the utility level. So yeah, these statutes and case law. But my lens for looking at those in the past have been mainly affordability programs and what's allowable. I can try to pull up probably, I think I'm only sharing one screen right now, but there's a project called, a report called Navigating Legal Pathways to Rate-Funded Customer Assistance Programs. And that's,
okay, and we'll talk about that one more in the next webinar too, when we focus on affordability, I'd imagine, right?
Right, yes, exactly. So stay tuned for that one. But in the meantime, you can Google that too. And it does give you like a 2 or 3 page summary for each state on the statutes for that state that relate to water rate setting.
Okay. Another question we got is, you showed a grid of sort of with 4 boxes of, you know, what are your utilities priorities, and how would one, like, how would I know that as a customer? Do I find that out by going and talking to my water system, or is there some other way you would infer that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So one way that your water utility staff would see that exercise is if they came to trainings by, you know, folks like me and others. But for you as an advocate or, you know, a watershed group to introduce that, I think the place is, or the most appropriate place is, one, going to their meetings when they are discussing budgets or the rate structure for the next year, and saying, well, okay, well, how did, you know, let's take a step back here. Can you just help me figure out, based on our water needs, based on our climate or whatever, how did you decide what the main objectives, like how would you rank this? So that's one way. But you know, we talked a lot about this too, Catherine, at River Rally a couple weeks ago. It could be intimidating to go to a board meeting or a city council meeting with this, you know, printed on a piece of paper and just pass it out to all the board members and say, hey, let's do an exercise, rank this. That might be a little bit inappropriate. But going to these meetings and being part of the conversation, just showing up, a lot of times the audience numbers are really, really low. And so it looks like they can do whatever they want and nobody's paying attention. So just showing up is really important. And then at some point, probably trying to meet one-on-one with somebody that you have heard present at this meeting, maybe the budget officer, the utility manager. Try to meet with one of them and say, you know, this is an exercise that maybe you guys want to consider. There are a lot of competing priorities, and I could try to, I'm going to try to go back to that slide. I think it was slide 14. And just engage them in a conversation. Probably not during the whole, you know, in front of it, like in a public meeting. So I think the slide is up here. One of the things I like to, I think that it's a good way to enter this conversation with utility staff, if it's in their office, especially, you know, sort of a one-on-one meeting, is that I understand that full cost recovery and encouraging conservation go really well together. So if we price the water higher, then these two objectives can be met. But it's a little bit more difficult when we're trying to meet these two objectives of encouraging conservation and full cost recovery and maintaining affordability. So I understand that this is part science, part art. You have a tough, you know, you have a tough job here because you're trying to achieve objectives that sometimes are at odds with each other. So that's a nice, comfortable way that I've used to start the conversation. And sort of acknowledging how difficult their job is and that some of these are sort of competing, at least on the surface, helps to move the conversation forward.
Gotcha. Okay, makes sense. And then finally, do we think we addressed the question that we had earlier about risk and rates, how that's reflected in there? Do you have anything else on that?
I don't have too much more on that, but there is another Excel tool that comes to mind that unfortunately I don't have in the slides, Catherine, and I will try to find a link to that. I believe it's one of those Water Research Foundation resources that's in front of the paywall where you can access it, and it's supposed to be an Excel tool that helps you pull in things like weather, population change, etc. for your given community, and it gives you like a risk factor that you can build into your rate setting. So I'll be happy to share that. We'll find a creative way to share that with everyone after. But it's a great question.
Okay, good. Any other questions, people? And did you have anything else, Stacey?
Well, I had seen one about, you know, I mentioned like one of the first few slides was a throwback to webinar 1 where I was saying that, you know, a lot of money is not coming from the federal government for water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure. And someone raised that there has been an exception to that, and that's true. In the last year or two, we're actually seeing the federal appropriations for 2 big pots of money for water infrastructure have actually increased. In some cases, it's almost doubled. And so that is an exception to that chart that I showed you guys with the lines where the federal funding for these types of projects has been sort of stagnant over time. But I think, unfortunately, that's sort of a short-term thing. So there's a lot of emphasis on infrastructure and bridges and, you know, transportation, etc. And in some cases, fortunately, I guess, water and wastewater and stormwater got folded in there. So in the last year or two, we have seen some increases. In fact, some states, and that's something that you should know too, so I'm glad that was brought up. The state revolving fund program managers in many states are like, wow, we have twice as much funding as we've had in the past. We've got to be creative. We've got to help these utilities put in loan applications because we have to get this money out of the door. The federal government is going to come back to us in a certain amount of time and say, why haven't you, you know, obligated these funds? Why haven't you loaned them out? So they're a little bit more open at the state level, I think, in some states to being flexible in the types of projects that they fund, because there's a little bit more pressure, there's a little bit more money. I don't expect that to continue forever. So yeah.
Good. Okay. So I want to make sure everyone knows that by being part of this webinar, we will be having what we're calling office hours sometime in the next month, and so I will send everyone something out about that. That basically Stacey will be sort of in a online chat room for an hour, so you can come and really have a conversation with her about any specific issues you want to. And so I'll send out shortly the information about that. One is on August 1st, and the other on August 22nd. So just so you know, we've got 2 more webinars in this series. The next one really builds on this one and talks about really specifically about addressing water affordability in water systems and how we make sure that everyone has access to essential water and no one is frozen out of this really important critical resource, as well as resource sustainability, more thinking about water efficiency, conservation, and the sustainability of the actual water source. So that one is on Tuesday, July 30th, coming up. And then switching gears a little bit, the last one in the series will be financing for innovative financing for green infrastructure, and that will be Stacey and her colleague from the city of Atlanta, who's working on a lot of different projects there. So you can register at the same place you registered for this webinar on our website. So I really hope you will join us for that one. So I want to thank Stacey for a great presentation today. We will be sending out a recording of this webinar as well as the last one, as well as Stacey's, a PDF of Stacey's slides with all those great resources in them, so you'll be able to have that. So Stacey provided her contact information, so I think that means you can feel free to reach out to her directly. And I'm at River Network as well, so feel free to reach out to me with any questions. We will, in the follow-up email, also be sending an evaluation. If you'd be so kind to fill that out, short survey out, that would super help us to make these better for everyone who's participating. So Stacey, any last words on water rates basics and what you need to know?
No, thanks for your time and attention. And I will say, I guess what I would add is if you have a colleague or two who you think may benefit from the next webinar in the series, we do have, I think, Catherine, we have some capacity that we can accommodate that. So yeah, encourage other folks to join in. It makes the discussion richer. It gives better questions or more questions. So we'd enjoy that.
Okay, awesome. Stacey, thank you so much for this great presentation today, and thank you all attendees for joining us and being on the webinar with us today, and we hope to see you next time. So with that, we will close it out for today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.